So we'd like to open it up for questions and discussion. If anyone would like to join in from the back there. Yes, thank you.
Kind of a long question here. I'm Roger Simpson, Associate Professor at the Department of Sociology here at Fresno State. And of course, the panel, no offense, and with Dr. Cady's joke notwithstanding, is really kind of the expression of why we need more diversity here at the university. But the question really goes to Dr. Thornton, who makes the argument that other types or elements of diversity don't count. What we're really talking about with diversity has to do with groups who have been historically and systematically disenfranchised economically, politically, socially, etc. And these are not to be confused with other elements of the diverse population that do not fit those critical points. Race and ethnicity has not been treated as superficial in the American historical experience. So what do you suggest or propose specifically that ensures equity and equality for everyone, or to achieve a diversity of minds that you mentioned, which, by the way, comes from a diversity of experience?
Well, first, I think that we would be honest about saying exactly what you just said, which I've never heard anybody in official capacity say explicitly that it is predicated on past disenfranchisement or whatever, that it's a kind of a reparations, all right? So first, be honest about that and say, when we use this feel-good word of diversity, this is what we really mean. But that's not, in my experience, I don't think that happens. I think the problem of, the people who had been at some level disenfranchised, oppressed, etc. The solution of bringing them, you're not going to bring everybody up to, of course, equality, but to not have inequality so concentrated, all right, would be to start from the bottom up instead of trying to start from the top down. And I would have thought that in the late 60s and the 70s that the concentration would have been starting in the K through 12 schools, right? Just talking in terms of strictly education, not the economy and all those other things. And really put the emphasis there. It would have taken longer to get to the point where then you would have candidates who were roughly qualified. Everybody was too impatient for that. They wanted results immediately. They wanted to take the easy way out, the cheap way out, rather than the more difficult. And if you look at the experience of various immigrant groups, for example, great influx of immigrants from the 1880s to about 1924, which is when they established immigration quotas because they decided they had enough Slavs and Catholics and Poles and Southern Italians, so they put the quotas on them so low that you wouldn't get as many as you would get Germans, etc. So you take that cohort, let's say, of Italians, their grandchildren didn't reach educational parity with other Americans until the 70s. That was about a 3-generation process. So that's long and slow and hard, and nobody wanted to do it. Right? And I think that's where we took a wrong turn. For whatever reasons, that didn't happen. I think you have to start from the ground up. You have to start with children in terms of their education all the way up.
Matt, if the green light's going to is this thing on? I couldn't agree more. And this is Dr. Thornton. Yeah, he took the word that I didn't use, which was reparations. And you both know that that is so unpopular that there's not a chance that would ever make it through the system, which she was speaking of the legal system, but this is why, in fact, when Martin Luther King said he had a dream, it wasn't a, actually, I have a dream, and I have a dream that people will stop misusing that speech. But it wasn't a premonition that it would happen, because there's a sense of an impossibility, as Frank Sinatra saying, to dream the impossible dream, and I think that that's more like it.
Robert Goulet.
Sorry. I get it on my satellite Sinatra channel, so I think everything's Sinatra. No, I couldn't agree with him more that this does have to be, if in fact there is something needs to be addressed here, it's got to start K-12, but it's got to be dramatic, and I don't think that anyone has the political will to do this. So on that point, I absolutely agree. Systematic, top down, but mostly bottom up. But talking about Marshall Plan type money.
So I wonder if I could ask the other panelists to respond to some of the claims that Dr. Thornton said were lacking. So you claim that no one discusses the meaning of the word diversity. You claim that universities don't take into consideration any other forms of diversity in admissions or in classrooms or in curricula. Right? You claim that there is no empirical evidence about the effect of diversity on our minds and on our capacity to reason, that there's no empirical evidence about the effect of education on wealth, right? And I wonder if in their readings, everyone on the panel has also found an analysis.
No.
Or they
Wait. I didn't say there was no, I didn't say anything about wealth. I'm saying about the official doctrine of diversity.
Yes,
is accepted as a self-evident good, but there's very little discussion about.
Actually,
all the other
yeah, there's quite a bit lately too, and so that's
whether or not the language of operations is never used, or whether or not the language
Yes.
of this as a form of right, whether or not that's ever been.
yeah. Well, and I want to go back to Professor Simpson's observation of the panel itself and the lack of racial diversity here. It's not lost lightly on that. But despite that lack of diversity of race, we did see a diversity of thought across all three panels in terms of what we were referencing. And that's not to say that it's the perfect mix, but I want to point out too, in my opening slide, the title of up there at the top is the 3 reasons why affirmative action is used. One is for a corrective measure regarding current inequality, current levels of inequality in education, in economic opportunity, and those kinds of things. Compensatory, which is to correct past wrongs. It's more of the idea of reparations that Professor Cady went into. And then the third one, which I didn't get to address in my comments because I was out of my time, which was the value of diversity. And so it's in there explicitly to recognize that affirmative action can be seen as attempting to address one or all 3 of those kinds of things. And there was a point of agreement, other than the last point, that we need to do more at the bottom up. And the other point of agreement that was across all 3 of us was symbolized by a quote by Margaret Neal. She's a professor of organizations and dispute resolution at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. In her 2006 article, she says, in fact, the worst kind of group for an organization, and I would add classroom, that wants to be innovative and creative is one in which everyone is alike and gets along too well. And I think there's a point of agreement on that. So let's look at the research. Just September 16, 2014, Scientific American, an article by Catherine Phillips, says that Supreme Court justices disagree on the virtues and value of diversity, and the means for achieving it. And it is reasonable to ask, as Professor Thornton does, what good does diversity do us? Diversity of expertise is clear, right? You wouldn't think of building a new car without engineers, without designers, without quality control experts. That's obvious. But what about social diversity? And so if we look at some of the more recent research on the benefits and value of social diversity, the fact is that you can, if you want to build teams of organizations capable of innovation, you need diversity. Diversity enhances creativity. It encourages the search for novel information and perspectives, leading to better decision-making and problem-solving and resolution. Diversity can improve the bottom line of companies, can lead to important new discoveries in science and health, and breakthrough innovations in entrepreneurship and economic avenues of opportunity. Just simply being exposed to diverse thinking can change the way and influence the way you think. And there's lots of research about that. Her own Margaret Neal Stanford University study looked at undergraduates and the diversity, the impact of diversity on small decision-making groups. Okay? The subjects were undergraduate students taking business courses at the University of Illinois. They put together 3-person groups, some consisting of all white members, others with 2 whites and 1 non-white, and they had them perform a murder mystery exercise. They made sure that all group members shared a common set of information, but they also gave each member important clues that only that one member knew. And to find out who committed the murder, the group members would have to share all of the information they collectively possessed. The groups with the racial diversity significantly outperformed the groups with no racial diversity because, according to the interpretation of these researchers, being with similar others, people who are like us, leads us to think that we all hold the same information and we all share the same perspective. This perspective, which stopped the all-white groups from effectively processing the information, sharing the information, hindered their creativity and ultimately their ability to solve the puzzle. And there are others. There's a study from Tufts University that looked at racially diverse groups of juries. Summers composed the 6-person juries of all white jurors or 4 white and 2 black jurors. And the diverse jurors were better at considering case facts. They made fewer errors recalling relevant information of the trial, and they displayed a greater openness to discussing the role of race in the case. These improvements didn't necessarily happen because black jurors brought new information to the group. They happened because white jurors changed their behavior in the presence of black jurors. So simply in the presence of diversity, the conversation and the thought process of the group is enhanced. And we could go on. There are others at the Harvard Business School. I mentioned Tufts and others about how diversity of teams. There's a great study by Freeman. I won't go into the details on this
Matt,
one.
I wonder if,
But that last one, I think, scientific teams. Let me mention that one piece.
Bruce
The scientific research about how successful science is looks at the diversity of authors on research publications. And so the great research, I'm not going to go into the details of that last one, but it showed basically that those research teams that had more diversity, and not just racial, but geographic diversity, even within the United States, let alone international, were more productive scientific contributions to the literature.
Bruce, you care to reply?
Well, how does that make better learning outcomes in a university?
I think one of the things that I appreciate the most about teaching at Fresno State is how diverse my classroom is. Because when I'm speaking, if I have that religious diversity, that gender diversity, the sexual orientation diversity, the immigration diversity, the race diversity, the age diversity, I'm thinking of the ones right off the top of my head. I can think of explicit ways in which those perspectives, were they not embodied in the person of that student sitting in that seat, would have never crossed the minds of other people in that room and contributed and enhanced to our thinking about that particular social topic.
Excuse me, how does that lead for those students to better learning outcomes?
I just mentioned.
No, you didn't say it. Did they do better in school? Did they get better grades? Did they have better graduation rates? Did they end up going to graduate school more frequently?
The learning was deeper and more comprehensive.
And how do you measure that learning was deeper after they leave your class?
So my experience ranges over 20 years of teaching at Fresno State.
And I have 40 years of teaching, and what I notice is that people learn based on the effort they put into learning. Now, depending on the certain kind of class that has a kind of content in which you have these kinds of sorts of conversations, and then the test and the grade is predicated on how the students remember what they learned, and you can measure it, but not everything is like that. You see what I mean? So, in fact, I would argue that the bulk of what goes on in most people's majors and in their training isn't anything to do with that. It's about, do they know the content they are tested on that they can then go forward,
let me intrude and bring in someone else from the audience, because I detect that this could go back and forth quite a few times. Professor Simba?
What has been the outcome for you?
The outcomes from my experiences here in class? Okay, I think that's what the question is. Okay, so I didn't mention it in my opening statement. I meant to, but I kind of forgot. My experience here in Fresno State is primarily as a philosophy student and minor in Japanese and mathematics, but I took a lot of these sociology, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation type courses because I was interested in them, particularly as a white male, and particularly as someone who had primarily a lot of white friends as a kid, and living around this area, you see, especially coming to university, it's much bigger than the charter school I went to. I noticed a lot of people that are a lot different from me, and a lot of times people have very different ways of living, very different ways of doing things. And I wanted to learn from these people instead of being offended or just simply disagreeing or saying, they're stupid, they do things differently, which I think too many of us do, especially people who don't go into higher education. That's a personal opinion. How it's personally affected me taking classes like Dr. Cady's class, Dr. Jendian's classes, Dr. Simba's classes, and others, is that I've gotten to meet, well, especially in a lot of those classes, sadly enough, I'm pretty much the only white person in most of the classes I took. And I thought that was sad, but at the same time, it was kind of a little bit of a blessing for me as an individual, because everyone else in the class had a completely different background than me. I mean, not completely different, but from different cultures, different inside jokes, different ways of living, different familial organizations and whatnot. And by mostly listening to what these other students would say and chime in during classrooms, I learned a lot of new perspectives. Most of what I learned from those classes was from having students unlike myself in those classrooms. And that is my personal experience and opinion on the matter.
So the question learned about familial structures, and the question learned about culture is having had contact with people of other cultures affect your answers to abstract philosophical questions, or to math, or to chemistry, right? Or does it only help you answer questions about diverse bodies?
No, it totally changed me. I mean, even in my philosophy classes, sometimes I think about things differently because of the way black students on campus or Mexican students on campus have affected me.
And that's the thing I want to point out, that the model that Professor Thornton is talking about is a great model for the 19th century and even the 20th century, where education focused on the 3 R's: regurgitation, reiteration, and replication. But if we expect in the 21st century to produce individuals who can think critically, who can be innovative and creative, then I think it's going to take exposure to diversity to develop that emotional intelligence alongside the traditional model of intelligence.
Can I just to get your question in a second? In some ways, I think we forget that diversity is our condition. I mean, it is simply our condition. We can quantify it, qualify it, and look and chart how many people are from what ethnicities are in our class, but it just is. And I don't think it should be vilified. I don't think it should be fetishized. It just is. We have to do with what we have. To paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld. Or not actually. So I don't know whether this whole idea of learning outcomes is really is going to make, I know there are people in the education department here are getting irritated, but the idea of learning outcomes is really a sufficient gauge of any of these things. I don't think that we've developed learning outcomes that are so sophisticated that they can qualify or quantify any of this. And I also don't know that we can really have this discussion about learning outcomes and about the impact of diversity within classrooms until you've left school for 5 to 10 years. I know, how has your attitude changed then? I know my personal philosophy in class is that I'm going to find out about you as diverse people and try my best to offend you, no matter how by any means necessary. And it may not necessarily be the right thing to do, but I think that for me it works, but we all have to move to our skill in order to address our diverse student body.